A millionaire farmer rescued a fragile, rejected bull from certain doom, but what he discovered later would change everything. What happens next will leave you speechless. The truck had broken down just beyond the bend where the two-lane road cut through a wall of pine trees. Preston Merrick caught sight of it as he crested the hill, a curl of smoke rising from the hood and a frustrated man pacing in the gravel shoulder, kicking at stones with the toe of his boot. He didn't intend to stop. His supply run was tight, and he didn't like delays. But something about the shape in the back of the truck made him ease off the gas. The trailer attached to the rig was old, the kind used by livestock companies who didn't expect their cargo to return. Inside, barely visible through the rusted slats, was a bull, young, undersized, barely more than skin and bones. Preston pulled to the side and stepped out. "Something wrong?" he called. The man looked up, wiping grease on his jeans. "Fan belt snapped. Got a tow coming. You don't got jumper cables, do you?" "Nope," Preston said, already looking past him. The bull didn't lift its head, didn't move. Its ribs pressed against its skin like they'd been there too long. There was dried blood on one flank and patches of hair missing. "Where's that one headed?" The man followed his gaze, then shrugged. "Bravemore rejected him. Didn't pass their behavioral trials or something. Bit of a dud. They told me to take him to slaughter on my way back." Preston squinted. "What's wrong with him?" "Too soft, maybe." "Doesn't respond to the handlers. Doesn't bulk up. Just stares at you like you're a ghost." He chuckled, but there was a flicker of unease in his voice. Preston stepped closer to the trailer. The bull shifted slightly, as if it had sensed him, but it didn't flinch or back away. Its eyes were dull but not absent. They were watching. Preston didn't know why, but something stirred in his chest, an ache he hadn't felt in years. "How much?" he asked quietly. The driver blinked. "For what? That thing?" "I'll take him off your hands, right now." "Seriously?" "He's not worth—" "I'll give you 600, and I'll tow you back to town." The man scratched his head. "You're crazy, but sure." It didn't take long to unhook the trailer, back Preston's truck up, and shift the bull into his own livestock hauler. The animal moved slowly, painfully, but without fear. As Preston shut the ramp behind him, he caught sight of something strange. A faint mark branded into the bull's right flank, mostly hidden under a layer of matted fur and grime. It wasn't a typical ranch brand. It looked like a symbol, a broken triangle intersected by a horizontal line. His brow furrowed. He didn't ask more questions, just drove. By the time he got back to Ember Hill Ranch, the clouds had thinned, and the sun spread across his fields in a golden wash. His foreman, Everett Hodge, met him near the paddocks. "What in the world is that?" Everett asked, peering into the trailer. "Rescue," Preston said, unhooking the latch. "Came from Bravemore." Everett stepped back, whistling low. "Bravemore doesn't sell their stock, especially not the ones they send to slaughter." He was rejected. They called him defective. Preston opened the gate, coaxing the bull out with soft clicks of his tongue. "Let's call him Rook." Everett didn't say anything at first. He watched as Rook stepped down, legs trembling under the weight of his own body. But he didn't stumble. He walked forward, slow and deliberate, until he stood in the pasture closest to the orchard, where the sun dipped low in the afternoons and the wind stayed warm. "I'll get the vet out," Everett muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "But Preston, what are you doing? This isn't like picking up a stray dog." Preston didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed on Rook, who now stood still in the field, breathing slow and even. That night, Preston couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, thinking about Nolan. His brother had been quiet, delicate, but sharp in ways that most people never noticed. When they were kids, Nolan had a way of sensing when Preston was upset, long before a word was spoken. He'd hum the same old tune every time, soft and wandering like a lullaby. Preston hadn't heard it in years. The next morning, Preston brought his harmonica with him to the pasture. He hadn't played it in a decade, but muscle memory took over. The notes hung in the air, gentle and meandering. Rook was grazing near the fence, ears flicking. Then he stopped chewing. He turned, and he walked, slow, steady, toward the sound. Preston's hands froze on the harmonica. Rook stopped 3 feet away and pressed his head gently against Preston's chest, just once, before backing off. Preston blinked, stunned. The behavior repeated again later that week, this time when Everett came near with a tagging pole. Rook refused to move, his muscles tense. He only relaxed when Preston walked over, murmuring quietly. Everett lowered the pole. "That's not normal," he muttered. "That's trained behavior, but you haven't trained him." Preston nodded, eyes still on the bull. "Number I haven't." A few days later, the vet arrived. Doc Calwell was in his 60s, gruff and efficient. He examined Rook's legs, took blood samples, and checked his eyes. Physical trauma, sure, he concluded, scribbling notes. But there's something else. I ran basic EEG scans. His brain's firing odd patterns, especially when exposed to certain tones. Meaning? Preston asked. Meaning, he's processing those sounds differently than most animals. Possibly memory retention, recognition. I've never seen it in a bull. And that brand... He turned over a print of the symbol on Rook's flank. That's not a ranch brand. That's something else. Later that night, Preston pulled out the old shoebox of Nolan's letters. Pages upon pages of scribbles, sketches, and notes from hospital beds. One sketch near the bottom caught his breath. A triangle intersected by a horizontal line, just like Rook's brand. Preston stared at it, his pulse rising. Was it a coincidence? Or something deeper? He didn't have answers, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just about a bull. Something had connected, past to present, brother to symbol, man to animal. Rook wasn't ordinary, and this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. Don't look now, Everett said, tightening the strap on a hay bale. But word's getting around that you've lost your edge. Preston didn't respond right away. He stood at the edge of the orchard pasture, arms crossed, watching Rook graze under the apple trees. The bull still moved with the same slow caution, but there was a rhythm to his steps now, as if each motion was calculated. Some of the ranchers are laughing, Everett continued. One said he'd seen you whispering to him, asked if you were training him to write poetry. Let them talk, Preston muttered, his eyes locked on the branded flank. They don't know what this is. And what is it exactly? Preston didn't answer. Not yet. Later that afternoon, Doc Calwell returned to deliver more test results. He looked more puzzled than concerned. I've treated sedated animals before, he said, setting down his briefcase on the porch. But whatever they gave him, it was heavy. Too heavy for a juvenile bull. Would have knocked out most for days. But he's up and moving like he barely noticed. Is there long-term damage? Not physically, but... Doc rubbed his jaw. When I ran the neuroresponse scan again, same pattern. High activity when exposed to sound, especially rhythmic frequencies. Most bulls? They'd maybe react once. This one remembers, recognizes. It's almost like he's listening on purpose. Preston said nothing for a long moment. Then, without looking up, he said, he recognizes a harmonica tune. One I used to whistle for my brother. Doc raised an eyebrow. You sure? I didn't believe it either. But he hears it, and he comes to me. Not just in curiosity, like he's coming back. Doc leaned back in his chair. That's not just memory. That's connection. That evening, Preston unlocked the old filing cabinet in the office above the barn. The top drawer hadn't been opened in years. Inside were notebooks, letters, and sketch pads. Everything Nolan had written from his hospital stays. He flipped through page after page until a loose sheet fell out and drifted to the floor. He picked it up and froze. Drawn in Nolan's familiar hand was a design. A triangle split by a single line. The same brand on Rook's flank. A chill ran through Preston's chest like a gust of cold wind. His legs carried him back to the barn without thought, and there in the dim light, Rook lifted his head the moment Preston stepped into the pasture. What are you? Preston whispered. The next morning, he made a decision. He opened his laptop, created a fake rancher profile under the name Kellen Doss, and submitted an inquiry form on Bravemore Stock's website, expressing interest in their livestock enhancement program. He made sure to write like a curious but wealthy investor. Just enough questions, not too much detail. 2 days later, a sleek folder arrived in a plain envelope. Inside was a glossy brochure showing Bravemore's pristine facility, endless green pastures, high-tech labs with men in clean white coats, and a line of bulls that looked too symmetrical, too clean, too manufactured. They offered behavioral enhancement, response training, and selective loyalty conditioning. No mention of drugs, no mention of sedation. But on page 9, in the background of a group photo, Preston saw it. A blurred figure of a juvenile bull, thin, underweight, standing apart from the others. Branded, the same triangle. His fingers clenched the edge of the page. Rook had been part of that photo shoot. Somehow he'd slipped through the cracks, and Bravemore hadn't noticed. Or had they? Preston called Everett into the house, spread the brochure across the kitchen table. I need your help digging, Preston said. Everett frowned. Digging where? Bravemore's history, ownership records, partnerships, anything that doesn't fit. They started that night. Preston on his laptop, Everett on the landline calling contacts from his old agri-tech network. Most leads were dead ends. Bravemore's public-facing documents were clean. Too clean. But then Everett struck something odd. There's a tech firm out in Marlow Ridge, he said, scanning an old trade directory. Sorellis Bioforge, registered last year, quiet, no press. But they signed a leasing agreement for 40 acres right next to Bravemore's border. Preston's eyes narrowed. Why would a biotech firm set up next to a cattle ranch? They wouldn't, Everett said. Not unless they were working together. They pulled every permit, patent, and research document they could find on Sorellis. Buried in a scientific abstract filed months earlier was a phrase that made Preston's stomach drop. Neuroassociative imprinting in genetically enhanced livestock. Early trials confirm responsiveness to controlled stimuli and behavioral tagging through sonic triggers. Sound triggers, Preston murmured, pushing away from the table. That's what the harmonica is. That's why he comes. Rook hadn't failed the program. He remembered it. What followed was a week of sleepless nights and methodical planning. They set up motion-sensitive cameras around Rook's enclosure. Preston tested responses to lights, sounds, even recorded commands played through a speaker. Rook didn't just respond, he recognized patterns. He tapped hooves in response to beeps, nudged certain gaits when music played, and avoided others that remained silent. It was more than instinct. It was training. Everett watched one of the playback videos with a stiff jaw. This ain't farming. This is programming. Preston leaned against the barn post, silent. The old fear inside him twisted into something else. Resolve. If Bravemore and Sorellis are trying to create controllable livestock, he said quietly, then they're covering it up. And they're getting rid of the ones who slipped through. Which means Rook was meant to be erased. The barn grew quiet. That night, Preston sat beside Rook's pen, watching the bull lie calmly in the straw. He had cleaned the area of sharp tools, locked the gates behind him, and turned the cameras off. Just silence, moonlight, and breath. He pulled out the harmonica and played the same tune Nolan used to hum when he couldn't sleep. It floated across the air like fog over a lake. Rook rose slowly, stepped toward him, and gently pressed his head against Preston's chest. Not by chance, not out of curiosity, but like he knew exactly what the song meant. Preston felt the answer form, not in words, but in certainty. Rook wasn't defective. He was the one that got away. The barn smelled wrong. Preston froze at the threshold, the late evening sun slicing through the doorway and casting long shadows across the trampled straw. His breath caught as his eyes scanned the mess. Feed sacks slashed open, grain scattered across the floor like blood from a wound. Tools were flung into corners. The filing cabinet he kept under the loft had been pried open, its drawers hanging like broken limbs. But it was the message that chilled him. Burned into the support beam near the entrance, blackened wood still smoldering slightly, were 6 crude words scorched deep with a cattle prod. Return what doesn't belong. Preston didn't move for a full minute. His heart was pounding, not with fear, but clarity. They'd found out. Not just about Rook, but the footage, the patterns, the work he and Everett had started. The silence he'd tried to keep had been a thin veil, and now they were tearing it away. He backed out slowly, then locked the door out of instinct, even though it no longer mattered. That night, he didn't sleep. He stayed seated at the kitchen table, a cold mug of coffee forgotten by his hand, his mind racing through possibilities. Leaving the state? Too suspicious. Going to the authorities? That would alert Sorellis before anything could be done. Number this had to be quiet, methodical, secure. He called Everett first thing in the morning. We've been compromised, Preston said flatly. They were here last night. Files are gone. They left a message. On the other end, Everett was quiet for a moment. Then, you sure it was them? Preston rubbed his temple. No signs of forced entry, no stolen equipment, just the files, the ones on Rook, and the footage. Who else would care? I'll reinforce my backups, Everett replied. And maybe don't keep Rook in the pasture anymore. Too exposed. Preston already had the same thought. I'm moving him into the tree line tonight. There's an old enclosure near the East Ravine. No power, but secluded. That'll work, Everett said. But we need to escalate. Make this public. Not yet, Preston said. We're close. One more pattern test. If he responds again, we'll have more than theory. By nightfall, Rook was moved under the cover of fog and quiet hooves. The massive bull walked willingly beside Preston, responding to his hand signals like a trained horse. In the moonlight, his frame looked less monstrous and more intelligent, like something watching, learning. The hidden enclosure was deep in the trees, shielded by brush and earth. Preston had reinforced the old wooden fence, laid straw, and installed a portable infrared camera camouflaged against the trees. Rook didn't resist. He entered, sniffed the air, then laid down. For a moment, Preston stood in the darkness, watching him. You know they want to erase you, right? He whispered. Rook's ears flicked. 3 days later, Everett went missing. Preston had texted him that morning, No reply. Called, straight to voicemail. By evening, a deputy from the town precinct rang Preston's doorbell. "We found Everett Hale's truck just outside Harper's Bluff," the man said. "Doors open. No signs of struggle inside." Preston blinked slowly, refusing to react. But he's not with the truck? Number and his phone was left behind. A cold weight settled in Preston's chest. Later that night, standing on the porch, Preston stared into the distance, toward the tree line where Rook now lived. He felt the invisible noose tightening. He knew Everett wouldn't just vanish. Someone made him vanish. That's when he made the decision. He pulled out his encrypted drive. Every file they'd collected, footage, timestamps, Rook's reaction logs, the implants they'd tracked through Micah's help, everything went onto it. But he needed more. He called Micah. "You still have that tone modulation software?" Preston asked. Micah's voice was cautious. "Yeah, why?" "I want to run the sequence again. But this time, record his response in full." "Preston, if they got Everett, you think they won't come after you next?" "That's exactly why I need this finished." Micah hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Fine, I'll send the tones." 2 hours later, in the orchard under the cloak of night, Preston stood with a small speaker on the ground and a camera strapped to a tree. Rook stood across from him, calm but alert, his massive frame backlit by moonlight. The first tone played. A low hum, barely audible. Rook's head twitched slightly. The second tone. He took a step forward. The third. And then, he tapped the ground with his hoof. Once, twice, then paused. Another tap. He repeated the exact order of the tones. Preston's breath caught. Again. He replayed the sequence, mixing the order. Rook responded. Perfectly. Not random. Not reflex. It was recognition. He ran 2 more tests, changed the frequency pattern slightly, and Rook adjusted. Not only reacting, but seemingly anticipating. On the 4th test, Rook nudged the speaker gently, then looked at Preston. A message. Or maybe, a question. Preston uploaded the footage onto the drive, then activated the auto-send encryption Micah had installed. The email would trigger if he failed to log in within 72 hours. It would go straight to multiple newsrooms, federal watchdog groups, and 2 former contacts in the USDA and Pentagon Everett had quietly listed. But Preston didn't wait. He packed a bag, loaded the drive into a steel case, took only what he needed, and then he drove. Miles of road fell behind him. Cornfields blurred into forests. The sky turned a deep indigo. He didn't play music. He didn't think of failure, only of what came next. The gates of Bravemore loomed just after midnight, tall, metallic, topped with surveillance spikes and motion-triggered lights. No one had invited him. No one was expecting him. But he wasn't here to be expected. He killed the engine. Opened the truck door. The drive case was tucked under his arm. From the guard post, a suited man stepped forward. "Sir, this is private property. You need to turn around." Preston didn't flinch. "I have something to return." "You're not on the appointment list. I'll have to ask you to leave." Preston raised the case slowly. "This belongs to your people, or at least it used to. You tell whoever's in charge that Rook remembers." The man's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" But Preston had already turned toward the camera perched above the gate, stared straight into it, and said the words clearly. "I'm here to trigger the reset." Then he walked forward, the steel case gleaming under the floodlight, and added nothing else. He gathered all their evidence, added one final test. He brought Rook into the orchard and played a series of coded tones. The bull approached, tapped the tones out in order with his hooves. It wasn't random. It was response. Preston uploaded the footage to a drive with auto-send encryption and attached it to a timed email. Then he drove straight to Bravemore's gates, not to beg, but to return what they'd tried to erase and trigger what he called the reset. 3 months later, the sun dipped low over the elm trees, casting long golden beams across the private pasture where Rook grazed silently. His dark coat had thickened since the day they pulled him from Bravemore. His ribs were no longer visible, and his eyes, once hollow, sunken with fear, now held a depth that came only from peace earned the hard way. There was no sound but the quiet rustle of leaves and the soft metallic clink of a wind chime on the sanctuary fence. Preston Merrin stood at the edge of the property, just beyond the wooden post that bore the name Nolan's Wake. He hadn't brought cameras, hadn't called the press. The truth had already been released weeks ago in one sweeping, calculated drop that had done what years of whispered warnings couldn't, make the world listen. He adjusted the sleeves of his work shirt, stiff from sweat and dust, and watched Rook nudge his nose into a patch of wild clover beneath the shade. The footage had gone out with a single statement. Not modified. Not trained. Just betrayed. Preston hadn't even signed it. He didn't need to. Micah's embedded verification tags had made the video tamper-proof, and the background data alone had done more damage to Sorellis Bioforge than any lawsuit could. Embedded audio logs captured the voices of handlers laughing during Rook's pain trials. Time-stamped files showed schedules of hormone injections, behavior suppressants, and the quiet removal of data trails when results went wrong. Sorellis denied everything, at first, called the video synthetic fabrication, said the bull had been conditioned to respond on command. But the scientists in the agri-ethics community weren't fooled. Micah had seeded proof into the smallest details: temperature readings matching public weather logs, voice matches pulled from leaked shareholder meetings, GPS pings traced back to Bravemore's sealed northern facility. Within 48 hours, Sorellis's stock plunged. Within a week, Bravemore's military contracts were frozen by the Department of Agricultural Integrity. But there was no celebration at Nolan's wake, only caution. Everett Lyle had been missing for nearly a month when Preston got the call. He'd been found in a rundown motel just across the state border, dehydrated and disoriented. A maid had called the local sheriff when she heard moaning behind a locked door. When Preston arrived, Everett's hands were trembling, his left eye swollen, a deep purple bruise running down his jawline. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "They knew where I lived, where I stored my copies," he rasped, sitting against the headboard as Preston brought him a cup of lukewarm water. "They said they didn't want to kill me, just wanted me to disappear for a while." Preston's grip tightened on the cup. "Did they say who they were?" Everett hesitated. "No names, just masks and gloves. But right before they left, one of them leaned down and said, 'You were lucky. He's not the only one.'" That phrase lodged deep in Preston's chest like a shard of glass. He didn't say anything, not for several long seconds. Outside the motel, crickets chirped under a dusky sky, but inside, the air felt heavy, too still. That sentence echoed louder than any threat because it confirmed something darker. Rook hadn't been an isolated project. He was part of a system, a pattern, a program. Later that week, Preston stood alone in the barn at Nolan's wake, watching the surveillance monitors. The sanctuary had no official staff, just a rotating group of volunteers from local animal welfare colleges. They were careful, quiet, no social media posts, no GPS-tagged photos. The sanctuary's location wasn't public, not even to most of the donors. Preston had sold off half of Ember Hill Farm to create the trust that protected this land in perpetuity. A legal wall, tall and reinforced. It wouldn't bring back Nolan, wouldn't erase the years they spent not speaking, but it made something out of the silence. It turned grief into place. That night, Micah arrived unannounced. He stepped out of his old beat-up sedan, wearing a wrinkled jacket and carrying a thermal bag of takeout. Preston met him halfway down the gravel path. "You still hate tofu?" Micah asked, lifting the bag. "Depends. Did you ruin it again?" They shared a tired chuckle as they walked into the barn, the light from inside pooling across the path like liquid gold. Inside, Rook rested beneath a heating lamp, calmly chewing hay. His ears flicked when he heard Micah's voice. "We've been monitoring the darknet chatter," Micah said later, setting his laptop on the workbench. "Mentions of Batch 7 and something called ARX Longhorn." Preston's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" "Still unclear, but Sorellis filed a private patent months before Rook was tagged. Something about neurospatial imprinting in bovine frontal cortex regions. It's buried, coded in legal nonsense. But if it's what I think it is, they weren't just altering instincts. They were trying to map fear." "Fear?" Preston asked slowly. "Fear responses, pain thresholds, long-term emotional retention. If they could control what an animal remembers, they could build stock that won't run, won't fight, won't resist." Preston's stomach turned. He looked at Rook again, at the old, faint scar still hidden beneath the thickening fur at the base of his neck. "That explains the dreams," he muttered. "What dreams?" Preston didn't answer. He remembered nights when Rook would thrash in the stall, huffing, panicked, charging at invisible things. The way he always avoided dark corners, certain shadows. Trauma that hadn't come from physical pain alone, but from memory. Micah closed the laptop. "We need to find the others. If they're out there—" "We will," Preston said. His voice was steady, but inside, every nerve felt like stretched wire. "But we need to be smart, quiet, no press, no flare, just eyes, ears, and time." And for the next 2 months, that's what they did. While Sorellis scrambled under investigations, Preston and Micah followed breadcrumbs, slaughterhouse anomalies, missing transport records, failed test batches quietly erased from federal logs. A pattern emerged. Bulls with unusually high cortisol levels, but no aggression reports. One had died of cardiac failure within days of purchase. Another had vanished during transport from a remote holding site. All signs pointed to one thing. ARX Longhorn hadn't stopped. It had just gone deeper underground. One late afternoon, as storm clouds rolled heavy over the hills, Preston stood at the edge of the pasture again. He'd just finished repairs on the north fence. His gloves were still on, the scent of oiled wood clinging to his skin. Rook grazed quietly a few yards away, the elm trees swaying above. The world felt still. Not calm, never calm, but suspended. From the speaker nestled beneath the feed shack, harmonica music played gently. One of Nolan's old songs. Preston wiped the sweat from his brow and whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "You were meant to live." Rook lifted his head, his ears flicking, as if hearing it fully. And just beyond the tree line, half hidden in shadow, another figure moved. A second bull. Taller, broader. A deep brand burned into his shoulder, familiar, but not identical. Preston's breath caught. The story wasn't finished. Not yet. "You were meant to live." Rook lifted his head as if in answer. And somewhere behind the trees, a second shadow stirred. Another bull, bearing the same brand. The story wasn't finished. Not yet. Disclaimer. The story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of compassion, unexpected discoveries, and the profound connections that can form between humans and animals. This narrative aims to highlight the value of every life, inspire empathy, and encourage a deeper appreciation for the unforeseen wonders around us.